The current president of the University of Maine Student Government became the first recipient of a new scholarship created in honor of Senator Susan Collins' late parents. Wynn native UMaine junior Keegan Tripp is the inaugural awardee of the Patricia and Donald Collins Scholarship. The $1,000 endowed scholarship is in memory of the Collins, who were both UMaine graduates and former Caribou mayors. Patricia served as the first female chair of the UMaine System Board of Trustees, among other organizations. At the award presentation today, Senator Susan Collins said a scholarship is the perfect way to commemorate her parents' commitment to public service and leadership. And to her, Tripp is a great inaugural pick to continue their legacy.
He understands how important the commitment to public service is. And since that was a characteristic of both my parents, it's really nice to see it reflected in the first recipient of the scholarship in their name.
To receive a scholarship in the name of people who I never, unfortunately, got the pleasure to meet, but I know has trickled down into and built up what this institution has become. It's one of the greatest honors I've had so far.
Beyond his role as president of UMaine Student Government, Tripp is also a member of the Alumni Association. He even interned in Collins's Bangor office.